Thank you very much. Gosh, you guys have got stamina. A few months ago, an organization called Freedom House released the results of its annual survey of the state of press freedom around the world. And its startling conclusion was that it's now at the worst that it's been in 13 years. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, last year, 79 journalists were murdered on the job. That wasn't a record. We hit that mark back in 2007 when about 120 journalists died because of their work. But it is broadly in line with historical trends in which about 100 journalists have killed each year simply for doing their jobs. What about those under arrest? Well, last year was a record. So what is it that's made journalism one of the most dangerous jobs in the world? Well, there are plenty of reasons why you might not want a journalist around. Think of perhaps Latin American drugs lords, for example, or anybody who picks up the Sunday papers these days. The problem is that if you look at the numbers, what's quite clear is that things started to change around 2001. I don't need to remind anyone here what happened in that year. That was 9/11. The man that changed the dynamic was a guy called George W. Bush. What happened was, in the wars of the past, they were generally over tangible things like land, water, and ethnicity. In those kinds of conflicts, journalists were considered as observers to the conflict rather than participants in it. It was dangerous, of course, working on front lines, as it always is going to be when you're in a place with plenty of bits of metal flying around at supersonic speeds. But as I said, journalists weren't targets. But George W. Bush changed the dynamic when he stood up in front of a joint session of Congress and he said, "You are either with us or you're with the terrorists." And with that single statement, what George Bush did was that he made the conflict a binary choice. Now, for journalists, that was incredibly challenging because it meant that if you were doing your job and reporting in line with your professional standards of balance, accuracy, and fairness, then by definition you had to go and report from the other side. You needed to get information from across the spectrum of the conflict. That meant that by definition you became part of the enemy in the eyes of the American government. Now, this is not an abstract idea. It's an idea that's had some very serious real-world consequences. I was a correspondent in Afghanistan back in 1995 for the BBC. And back then we used to routinely cross the front lines to speak to what was then the most potent military and political force in the country. And that was the Taliban. Now, the Taliban didn't necessarily agree with us, they didn't necessarily like my theology or my politics, but they understood that we were legitimate parts of the battlefield, that we had a role to play, and they accepted us. And at the same time, plenty of governments also encouraged us because they also recognized that there was a value in our reporting that was able to help them understand what was taking place with the Taliban, where they were coming from, what they were thinking. If we go forward then to 2001, I went back to Afghanistan and I was watching the American bombardment of Kabul as they were trying to oust the Taliban from power. And what happened then were a few things that really made me appreciate that something fundamental had changed for journalists. One of the bombs that fell during the bombing campaign landed squarely on the Al Jazeera bureau. Now, the Americans at the time said that it was a mistake, it was an accident, one of these things that happens. Then they later wrote to Al Jazeera and acknowledged that in fact they had targeted a building that they thought was harboring Al-Qaeda terrorists. Now, Al Jazeera had, of course, been running interviews with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but as one of the editors pointed out, these organizations were parties to the conflict, and as a news organization, they had a moral and ethical responsibility to go and find out what it was that they were saying. A few weeks later, the Taliban intercepted a convoy that was driving from a place called Jalalabad in the east of Afghanistan up to Kabul, and they pulled just 4 people out of that convoy. All of them were journalists. One of them was an Australian cameraman called Harry Burton. The other was a wonderful Italian journalist who also happens to be a very good friend of mine called Maria Grazia Cutuli. The Taliban dragged them off into the desert, away from the road, and they emptied the magazines of their Kalashnikovs into them. Early the following year, a few months later, Al-Qaeda kidnapped and beheaded the Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, again because he happened to be a journalist. Now, each of these reporters were targeted not because of anything any particular military secrets that they were about to expose. They were murdered simply because they were journalists who were doing their jobs and reporting from across the spectrum of the conflict. One of the problems with the war on terror is its indefinability. A good friend of mine once joked that George W. Bush had declared war on an abstract noun. It means whatever anybody wants it to mean, and since then, governments around the world have massaged and stretched the term to include anybody all sorts of people that they'd consider to be enemies, and often that's included journalists. Now let's go back to those journalists under arrest. The figures tell us that the vast bulk of them, rather just a small fraction of them, are there for what we might call journalistic infractions, journalistic misdemeanors, things like defamation and slander. Not exactly the kinds of things that you'd expect to wind up in prison for, but there you go. The vast majority of them, more than 2/3, are in prison for crimes against the state, things like sedition and treason. And guess what? That's exactly what we were facing when we were arrested in Egypt. Now, I went to Egypt in December of 2013 to cover the unfolding political crisis that was going on in Egypt at the time. And on the night of the 28th of December, the security agents raided my hotel room and the room of my colleague, Mohammed Fahmy, and the house of my other colleague, Bahar Mohammed. They arrested us, hauled us in, took us down to the state security buildings for interrogation. Here's what we were charged with: aiding a terrorist organization, being members of a terrorist organization, financing a terrorist organization, broadcasting false news to undermine national security. Now, at the time, it made no sense to me. I simply couldn't understand what was going on here. What we'd been doing was what I'd consider to be fairly common journalism, fairly basic journalism. The government makes a statement, you go and speak to the opposition to find out what they think, and then you find an analyst to make sense of it all. Vanilla reporting. The gap between what we're accused of doing and what we actually did was so vast that I really couldn't see how we'd wound up in that situation, until it finally dawned on me. The opposition, of course, in the classic model of democracy is the party that last formed government. And in Egypt at the time, that happened to be the Muslim Brotherhood. They'd formed the first democratically elected government in Egypt's history, until they were ousted in a coup about 6 months before we arrived. And what the government was trying to do, what the government wanted to do, or what the reason they came after us was not because of anything we had done, not because of our reporting per se, it was because of what we had come to represent. The government wanted to shut down freedom of the press. They wanted to attack one of the most fundamental elements of any democracy, and that's the capacity for people to have a complete range of political views. Since then, the government has introduced a whole raft of legislation dealing with terrorism so that even if you simply disrupt a civil servant from his duties, you can be hauled in as a terrorist. Now, Egypt isn't the world's greatest jailer of journalists. That honor goes to Turkey. There, the crackdown began after the attempted coup last year. Since then, the government has gone after anybody that they consider to be either connected with the party that they've accused of being behind the coup, or anybody who indeed has been overly critical of the government. That's often included academics, lawyers, and of course journalists. At the moment, there are about 100 reporters who are behind bars, and 100 news organisations, more than 100 news organisations, have been shut down. Closer to home, Burma has convicted 5 people on terrorism charges simply because they published a calendar that described the Rohingya community, which happens to be Islamic, as an ethnic minority. So what about the world's greatest bastion of free speech, the United States? That was, the founding fathers there saw that freedom of speech, freedom of the press was so important that they passed the First Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees that the government can never pass any piece of legislation that limits press freedom. Well, it turns out that the US also has the Espionage Act that was passed in 1918 to help the government deal with spies who are sending national secrets to the enemy. From 1918 until 2008, the government used the Espionage Act a total of 5 times. And then came Barack Obama. His government used the Espionage Act more than twice as often as all of his predecessors combined. Now, that would be perfectly understandable if the people that they were going after were selling military secrets to the Russians or giving away CIA counterterrorism strategies to Al-Qaeda. But that simply didn't happen. In every case, the government prosecuted either journalists or more often their sources because they were revealing stories that were politically embarrassing to the government. For example, someone who was revealing alleged allegations of corruption around the sale of surveillance equipment. What Barack Obama began, Donald Trump has weaponized. He's accused the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post of being enemies of the state. He has blocked several of the world's leading news organizations from White House briefings. And most recently, they've opened up investigations into the sources of leaks of information relating to the Trump campaign's connections to the Russians, using, guess what? Yep, the Espionage Act. Now, I'm not suggesting that the United States is about to become Egypt anytime soon, but it really concerns me that we're seeing governments around the world using the war on terror and national security as an excuse to chip away at one of the most fundamental elements of our democracy. And it's happening here in Australia too. Since 9/11, we've seen a whole raft of pieces of legislation all dealing with national security, but there are a few that I want to give you some examples of. There's Section 35P of the ASIO Act. 35P makes it a criminal offence to reveal any information about what's known as a special intelligence operation, an SIO. The problem is that that designation, the SIO designation, is itself a secret. So a journalist simply picking up the telephone and starting to ask questions about the work of the security services, which is something I as a journalist would consider to be a perfectly legitimate piece of our work, can unwittingly make themselves in violation of the law and find themselves in prison for up to 5 years. Then there's metadata legislation, which gives a whole host of government agencies the power to go into anybody's metadata without a warrant. The only exception to this rule is journalists, and that's a good thing, except that we know the AFP, the Federal Police, has already gone into a journalist's data accidentally. But here's what's crucial. It doesn't protect a journalist's sources. So any government official who believes they have important information about a wrongdoing in government, simply again picking up the telephone and talking to a journalist, makes themselves vulnerable. Now, the government said that this was for national security. Well enough, except that metadata has already been used to investigate the sources of leaks about the conditions on Manus Island and Nauru in the detention centres. It's also been used to prosecute a leaker who exposed serious security breaches at Sydney Airport. Then a journalist who wants to really understand what's going on, what makes a young Muslim perhaps go and fight for Islamic State, can find themselves in breach of the Foreign Fighters Act, which forbids the advocating of terrorist ideology. Now, this is not just an issue for me as a journalist. What concerns me is the way that this is chipping away, again, at some of the most fundamental elements of the way our democracy works. It's eroding what one organisation has called the grey zone. And by that they mean that space which allows us to have nuanced, subtle, complex debates. It's the space that allows us to live in a multicultural, pluralist society alongside all sorts of people of different races, ethnicities, religious beliefs, politics, and so on, without ending up in acrimony, without falling into open combat. It's a space that allows us to have vibrant public discussions about policy without winding up in prison. In short, it's the space that's allowed Australia to become one of the most prosperous, stable, and peaceable democracies on the planet for the past 200 years. Now, guess which organisation uses the term the grey zone? It's not Amnesty International. It's not some liberal think tank. It is Islamic State. IS has an online magazine they call Dabiq. And a few years ago, they published a cover story in which they called it the extinction of the grey zone. In this article, what Islamic State did was that they explained that one of their key strategies is to erode the capacity for us to live side by side with all sorts of different ethnic communities, and in particular, the Muslim community. They want to destroy our capacity to have these kinds of open, subtle debates. They want to make the conflict a binary choice. And in this article, there's one man that they quote very prominently as supporting their argument, supporting their case. The man they quote is George W. Bush, and the line they use is, yep, that line from the joint session of Congress, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Now, in my work in some of the more authoritarian places around the world, I've noticed that there seems to be a kind of sliding scale where you've got press freedom at one end along with a whole host of other democratic rights, and you have a police state at the other. And in this current environment, it's really tempting for governments to drag the slider to the right, trading off press freedom in the name of national security. But the problem is that we know from history that a police state can never really deal with terrorism. We know that it's very easy for one man to drive a truck into a crowd. And perversely, the best way to deal with extremist ideology is to have vibrant public debate with a press that is free to go and interrogate not just governments, but anybody whose views drift off to political extremes. Islamic State knows this, which is why they want to stop this. Ladies and gentlemen, there is one man who I think sums this up very well. His name is Albert Camus, who was a French philosopher, and he said, "A free press can, of course, be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad." Thank you.